I want to show you how I turn this into this. Recently I mixed this beautiful cover of the Last of Us theme by cellist and composer Brianna Tam, and this mix was a really interesting balance between solving problems and enhancing the song, but still trying to preserve the song's authenticity and not get in the way of the performance. So here's the session. I'm gonna skip all the boring mix prep stuff like gain staging and routing and just jump right into the actual mixing. To start, here's the song in mono with no processing, just volume balancing. So before we can enhance anything, we need to address the problems in the mix. What immediately jumps out to me is that there's way too much low end. I like the overall volume balance, but frequency-wise, the low end is really boomy, and it's taking over the rest of the mix. I started by finding exactly what in the mix was causing this low end buildup. The pizzicato, especially this track here, is responsible for a lot of the boominess. These three tracks as well have way too much low end. Since this is an acoustic song, I wanted to be as subtle and transparent as I could, and so I mainly used dynamic EQ to turn down certain low-end frequencies. Rather than remove a ton of low-end energy across the whole track, dynamic EQ lets me cut low-end frequencies, but only when they go above a threshold. So basically I want to process this track without it sounding processed, and dynamic EQ helps keep my mixing moves pretty transparent, especially when the problems are only on certain notes or in certain sections. So here's what the mix sounds like before and after these low-end cuts. It sounds a bit more balanced, right? At this point, I'm just trying to get the mix to a baseline level of quality before worrying about enhancing anything. Another thing I heard was some harshness, particularly on these tracks here. There's definitely some frequency buildup, especially at around 2K. One of my favorite ways to deal with harshness is a plugin called Soothe. This is a dynamic EQ that's really good at reducing frequency buildups in the mid-range and high-end. I also used some static EQ as well to cut more harsh energy from the upper mid-range. At this point, I felt like I'd brought the mix to a good baseline level. Here's the difference between where we started with no processing and all the EQ so far. It's a pretty noticeable difference, right? In this mix, most moves were really subtle, like a 1% improvement. But when you add all of them together, you get a significant difference, which is so satisfying. So now that we've solved the problems, we can move on to the really fun part, which is enhancing the mix. Two of my absolute favorite ways to do this are with the clariphonic EQ and with Gullfoss. I used the clariphonic to add some really nice high end, and Gullfoss on a few different buses to add more clarity. Here's what that sounds like. This is where you get that high-end sheen and the song actually starts to sound mixed. At this point, I was happy with the frequency balance, and so I moved on to the second part of enhancing the mix, which was adding reverb and delay. The reverb in this mix ended up being really subtle, like more of a felt instead of heard kind of thing. I used 3 different room reverbs to create a sense of depth. These 3 reverbs were all the same, except with different pre-delay, distance, and early and late reflections. This technique lets me create a reverb for the very front of the mix, one for the middle, and then one for the back. I can then send every track to one of these three reverbs depending on how close or far I want that sound from the listener. So for example, this ultra high melody track. This is an important track that's bringing out the main melody, and so I have it sent to the front reverb. Whereas this low legato track, this is more of a supporting part that's filling out the rest of the mix, and so I sent it to the back reverb. These reverb sends help me add a sense of depth and cohesion to the mix, and also help draw attention to the most important tracks. But it's meant to be really subtle. I also used a stereo slapback delay on certain tracks. This section is actually mono, it didn't need any panning, and so this delay helps add a sense of width to the mix. And that's the finished mix. Let's do one more comparison before and after mixing. To make things a little more straightforward, in this video I just focused on one section of the song. You can hear the full track in the link below. But this was my process for the entire mix. Once the volume balance was done, I focused on solving problems, which in this case were boominess and harshness. Once that was dealt with, I enhanced the mix with EQ and spatial effects. You may have also noticed that I used a lot of dynamic tools like Soothe and Gullfoss and ProQ's dynamic EQ. These tools are really useful at making a mix sound great, but without overprocessing or getting in the way of the performance, which is so important when you're mixing acoustic music. But regardless of what genre you're in or tools you're using, volume balance, problem solving, then enhancing is an amazing mixing workflow, and one you should try if you haven't. If you found this video interesting, definitely subscribe. Check out more of Brianna's music, you can find a link in the description. And if you'd like your track mixed or mastered or just want to talk about your music, feel free to reach out. Thanks for watching.